Right, brilliant. Well, first thank you, Nigel, for doing this for me today. So really want to pick your brains about the whole contracting industry, that sort of world. So firstly, I'll just dive straight in, and could you tell me a bit about IR35 Accountant and what it is that you do?
Yes, we've been looking after contractors since 2009, so 10 years in the business, and we've been working with at one time was called the Professional Contractors Group, PCG, and subsequently IPSI, in terms of making sure that we've been up to speed with all the recent legislation and changes in the industry. And I think we have a rather unique approach to looking after our clients, in the sense that we're not a factory operation, we're a small firm of chartered certified accountants, and each of our clients is looked after directly by a qualified accountant. So we provide a very personal service, and we tend to use a cloud-based approach for looking after our clients, typically for our contractor clients using free agent software, which people might be aware of. It's very widely used within the industry and very easy to use, very intuitive. So our ethos really is to make life easy for our clients as far as we possibly can, and provide them with a professional service.
Great, thank you. So expanding on what you've said about the services that you provide to contractors, I think I'm right in saying that the rules are set to change next year. Could you give us an overview of what is likely to happen?
Yes, it's as ever with HMRC and the government, it's not a simple situation, but historically the onus of responsibility for complying with the IR35 legislation has laid with the contractor themselves. So if they got it wrong, if they didn't have their contract reviewed and it was subsequently found to be not IR35 compliant, then the contractor would be the one that would be liable to pay the extra tax and national insurance that's due. A couple of years ago, the government brought into play a change in that, but for the public sector only. So public sector bodies were under an obligation to themselves be responsible for compliance rather than the individual contractors. And so what's happened subsequently is that's been running for 2 or 3 years now. The government from 2020 want to bring that same change of the placement of responsibility from the individual contractor to the end client into the private sector.
Okay, and I mean, I use contractors, and sometimes we employ the services of those contractors through agencies. So how is that? Is that going to? That seems like it may muddy the water a bit.
Yes. Yes, and very often contractors work through agencies. That's how they find their work. So just to give a little bit of a flavour as to what happened when this legislation was introduced into the public sector, what happened then initially was that a lot of public bodies just said, we don't want any risk, we'll just assume that all the contractors that work for us are caught by the legislation. We can't be bothered to sort of look into it any more deeply than that, and therefore we'll start deducting tax and national insurance, and incidentally, not only employees' national insurance, but also employers' national insurance from all the monies that are paid over to the contractor. Now this caused an absolute furore in the public sector. From the contractor's point of view, their take-home pay was effectively going down by 40%, and so an awful lot of them decided that actually I'll go and work in the private sector because I could be paid my going rate there, and the private sector take a commercial view. So that's how it started out. Over time, a lot of public sector bodies have changed their view and have looked at the situation more commercially, and have actually looked at contracts on their own merit and working practices on their own merit, and where applicable, the same scenario of being able to trade through a limited company without having all the national insurance deductions of an employee are very much still available to workers in the public sector if they work for the right public sector body and they work through an agency who are up to speed with the way the legislation works. So that's the backdrop. In the private sector, when the new rules come into play in April 2020, I imagine there will be a similar sort of situation, but maybe not to the same extent, because the private sector tends to be more commercially minded anyway, and if they have contractors that work for them now and they want to retain those contractors post April 2020, then it makes sense to look commercially at the contractual arrangements now and ensure that come the day they're not in a position where they're going to have to deduct all the national insurance as if the contractor's an employee. Now, in terms of the complication in that, come the new legislation, the end client will be the one that has the onus of responsibility in terms of determining the status of the contractor. However, it could be the case that if that is got wrong for whatever reason, then the agency could be the ones that pick up the tab for the additional tax that's payable. So it's really quite a complicated situation, and therefore there needs to be a kind of a working together approach between the contractor, the agency and the end client to make sure that come April 2020 they've got their ducks in a row and they're not going to have a problem with the new regime.
Do you feel that there's perhaps a lack of information out there at the moment? Because, to be honest, it's only having spoken to yourself that I know anything about this at all. And obviously I'm an employer, like I say, I use contractors, they're an integral part of our business. And I don't know anyone else that is mentioning this, doing anything about it.
No, I think that's a really important point, and I think like so many of these things, what happens is that people have got a vague idea of a change, but they want to just sort of bury their heads in the sand until, 3 or 4 weeks before the deadline, everyone will go, oh my goodness, what do we do? And the point is, with this particular legislation, that won't work, because you have to think in advance. You have to make sure that the contractual arrangements between the contractor, the agency and the end client are properly thought through in advance of the legislation being introduced. So I would say this, wouldn't I? But I think you have to start now. It's only, it's 10 months away probably before implementation. Given the number of people that are in the chain and the fact there are large organisations involved in the chain at the end user end, then it takes a long time for decisions to be made and the right processes to be put in place.
And does that mean what IR35 accountant currently does is going to change, evolve perhaps? I mean, whereas historically you've dealt just with the contractors, presumably this means now you're going to be speaking to the end clients, to the agency as well as the contractors.
Yes. Well, yes, that's a very good point. What we're in the process of doing at the moment and have been doing for the last 2 or 3 months is, as part of our practice, we have what's called fee protection insurance, which essentially means that if HMRC open an inquiry into any of our clients, then the cost of defending our client is covered by insurance. And what we're doing is talking to our insurer for our fee protection insurance, and together what we are doing is talking to agencies and the end client, as well as our own contractor clients, to inform them about the changes. And the point here is that if the chain is entirely compliant, then our insurer will insure both the end client and the agency against any potential tax loss. So there's a real incentive to start things now, so that the contractual arrangements and the working practices can be reviewed over a period of time to make sure that come the day you are both compliant and you have the potential to have that risk, because it's been mitigated by putting all the right things in place, to have that risk insured so that you have peace of mind.
Excellent. And looking historically, did you have contractor clients that were affected by the legislation in the public sector?
We did, yeah, and we did have some clients that worked in the public sector. Well, there's sort of 3 scenarios really, I suppose. There were some that worked in the public sector that were deemed by the end user to be caught by the new regime, and so they've just accepted that. That's scenario number 1. Scenario number 2 was we had clients that worked in the public sector but then migrated to work in the private sector, as I alluded to earlier on, because that was the way of maintaining their income. And we also had quite a number of clients actually who undertook discussions with their end client and actually persuaded them that they should look at things differently and end up with a more commercial view of their relationship, and actually that worked. And it took a little while for that to happen because these organisations tend to move quite slowly, but eventually, I think, I'm speaking off the top of my head, but I think roughly 60% of our public sector client base were in the same sort of contractual situation after the change as they were before.
Okay, so do you think then that because this is obviously in the private sector, much more of a commercial view is going to be taken on this, so do you think things will happen a lot more quickly and the end client will be much more reasonable and probably take better steps to ensure that their contractors are...
One would imagine so. I mean, the proof of the pudding is in the eating. I think any large organisation has quite a complex sort of command structure. So there will be, I imagine, quite a bit of discussion and sort of horse trading before that situation is reached. But I think it's more likely to be reached with private sector clients than it was with the public sector. And I guess from the public sector point of view, that they've also got a bit of a view on government's view of this, which is essentially that they want more tax take. I mean, that's the bottom line in all of this, really. And so there's more of a kind of probably more pressure on public sector bodies to comply in a way that means that they deduct the extra tax and national insurance, because that's what government wants, essentially. Private sector, they don't have that responsibility, so I imagine they'll be more commercially minded and more speedy in sorting it out.
I don't know about you, Nigel, but I always find when I look at this situation that actually it can be quite unfair on the contractor. I mean, the contractors we use, I mean, it's literally for projects, so it could be 2 months, it could be 6 months. Yeah. They have none of the rights of our normal workers. Don't you think that that perhaps, in the grand scheme of things, that they have a bit of an unfair deal?
You're inviting me to get on my soapbox. I think you're 100% right. I mean, if you are a contractor and you are caught by IR35, or even worse, someone deems that you're caught even though you're probably not, when looked at your working practices in detail, then you're in the worst of all situations, because you're paying income tax as an employee would, you're paying national insurance as an employee would, and you're paying employers' national insurance on top of that at 13.8% of most of your earnings. At the same time, you have no sick pay, you have no holiday pay, you have no maternity pay. You're on your own, and probably on very short notice periods, and no support from unions or anything like that. So, absolutely right. Which is why it's crucial to me that contractors should ensure that if they have to take those risks, that they are getting properly compensated for that.
I know you've kind of touched on this anyway, but being a bit more specific, what should contractors, or even indeed the end clients or the agencies, what do they need to do to get this, either to minimise their risk or hopefully eliminate the risk altogether?
Well, I think that the steps are, first of all, for all our contractors, every single new client that we take on, we ensure that contractor has their contract reviewed from the point of view of does it comply with IR35 or not. That, I know, is not something that's done universally in the industry. So I think point number one for every contractor is, if you don't know whether your contract that you're working under now is compliant with the legislation, get a contract review done, because come April next year, it won't be you that has to make a decision, it will be somebody else, and you've lost the opportunity to change anything. So get your contract reviewed now. For agencies and the end user, as I say, to me, the holy grail in this for the end user is to have the same bank of contractors that you use now, but to make sure that the new rules don't apply wherever possible, so that you can benefit from the insurance that I talked about to put peace of mind in place and to ensure that you retain the contractors that you know are going to do a good job for you. And that means starting now, and I would suggest get in touch with us and we'll have a no obligation conversation about what the next step should be.